At 07:55 hours on the morning of December 7, 1941, the history of the world changed forever on the island of Oahu. It was a beautiful Sunday morning. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air smelled of salt and tropical flowers. Sailors on the battleships were waking up, drinking coffee, writing letters to their sweethearts back home. The band on the USS Nevada was preparing to play the Star-Spangled Banner, peace, quiet, and then a low hum appeared on the horizon. It sounded like a swarm of angry bees. Within seconds, the hum turned into a roar, and the roar turned into a scream. The first Japanese dive bomber broke through the clouds. The red circle of the rising sun was painted on its wings. The first bomb fell. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The pride of the United States Navy, the mighty Battle Row, became a slaughterhouse of steel and fire. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. An armor-piercing bomb smashed through 4 decks and ignited the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton ship out of the water. It broke the ship's back. In a fraction of a second, 1,177 young men were erased from existence. The water of Pearl Harbor turned into a thick soup of oil and blood. Men jumped into the water to escape the flames, only to find the water itself was burning. By 1000 hours, the attack was over. The Japanese planes flew away, leaving behind a scene from hell. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, 300 airplanes were destroyed, 2,403 Americans were dead. The United States, the sleeping giant, had been beaten to its knees. The psychological blow was devastating. For the next few months, the news was a constant drumbeat of defeat. The Japanese Empire moved across the Pacific Ocean with terrifying speed. They were efficient, they were ruthless, and they seemed invincible. They took Guam, they took Wake Island, they took Hong Kong, they invaded the Philippines, forcing thousands of starving American soldiers into the horrific Bataan Death March. Back in the United States, the atmosphere was one of pure terror. On the West Coast, in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, panic set in. People believed the Japanese Navy was coming for them next. They painted their windows black to hide from bombers. They dug air raid shelters in their gardens. They looked at the ocean with fear. In Washington, D.C., the mood in the White House was dark. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair in the Oval Office. The room was filled with cigarette smoke and grim-faced generals. The maps on the wall were covered in red markers, showing the Japanese advance swallowing the Pacific. The president's advisors told him to be cautious. "Mr. President," they said, "we have lost our fleet, we are weak, we need to retreat, we need to rebuild, we must wait until 1943 to launch a counter-offensive." Roosevelt listened. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles were white. He slammed his fist on the heavy wooden desk. No, he did not want caution. He did not want to wait. "I want to hit them," Roosevelt demanded. His voice was shaking with rage. "I want to hit them where they live. I want to drop a bomb right on the roof of the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo. I want the Japanese people to look up at the sky and know that they are not safe." The room went silent. The generals looked at their shoes. The admirals shifted uncomfortably. They had to tell the president the hard truth. "Sir, it is impossible." It was a matter of simple geography. Japan was thousands of miles away from the nearest American base. The U.S. Navy had aircraft carriers. Yes, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, but their planes were small. The Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers had a combat radius of only 300 miles. To bomb Tokyo, an American aircraft carrier would have to sail right up to the Japanese coastline. It would be suicide. The Japanese Navy had a massive defensive perimeter. Their land-based bombers would spot the American carriers 500 miles out and sink them long before they could launch a single plane. The experts agreed. Striking Tokyo was mathematically impossible, but in war, sometimes the impossible just needs a different perspective. January 1942, Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine operations officer, was waiting for a flight at an airfield in Norfolk, Virginia. He was bored. He stared out the window at the rain below him on the tarmac. The Navy had painted the outline of an aircraft carrier deck. They used it to train young pilots on how to land on a ship. As Captain Lowe watched the painted deck, two loud engines roared overhead. He looked up. It was a pair of Army bombers, B-25 Mitchells. They were practicing low-level bombing runs. Captain Lowe looked at the huge Army bombers. Then he looked at the short, painted carrier deck. A spark ignited in his brain. A crazy, ridiculous idea. He did some quick mental calculations. What if, he whispered to himself, what if we put medium-range Army bombers on a Navy carrier? It sounded insane. Army bombers were beasts. They were designed to take off from long, concrete runways. They were wide, they were heavy. They didn't have tail hooks to catch the wires on a ship if they took off from a carrier. They could never land back on it. It would be a one-way ticket. But Army bombers had long legs. They could fly 2,000 miles. Carrier could take them close enough. They could launch, bomb Tokyo, and then keep flying all the way to China. Captain Lowe took his idea to Admiral Ernest King. Admiral King took it to General Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces. They didn't laugh. They realized that this desperate, crazy plan was their only hope. But to lead a mission this dangerous, they needed a special kind of leader. They needed a man who was equal parts genius and daredevil. They needed Jimmy Doolittle. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was 45 years old. He was short. He was bald. If you saw him on the street, you might think he was a university professor. But behind that calm face was a tiger. Doolittle was a legend. He was a racing pilot who had broken speed records. He was an aeronautical engineer with a doctorate from MIT. He was the man who proved that pilots could fly blindly, using only instruments. When General Arnold called him in and whispered the details of the secret mission, Doolittle didn't blink. He ran the numbers in his head. Lift, drag, thrust, wind speed. It can be done, Doolittle said, but it will be tight. He chose the plane, the North American B-25 Mitchell. It was a solid aircraft, fast, tough. It could take a beating, but as it stood, the B-25 was useless for this mission. The distance was the killer, from the launch point to Tokyo, and then to safety in China, was over 2,400 miles. The standard B-25 carried 640 gallons of fuel. That was enough for maybe 1,000 miles. If they flew with standard tanks, they would run out of gas and crash into the ocean long before they reached Japan. They needed to double the fuel capacity, but fuel is heavy. Gasoline weighs 6 pounds per gallon. Adding 500 extra gallons meant adding 3,000 pounds of weight. And the B-25 was already too heavy to take off from a carrier deck that was only 500 feet long. It was a paradox. To reach Tokyo, they needed more fuel, but if they added more fuel, they would be too heavy to take off. Doolittle's solution was radical. Strip them, he ordered. Strip them to the bone. They took the bombers to Eglin Field in Florida, and the surgery began. Doolittle walked around the planes with his mechanics. He was ruthless. The military radio, Doolittle pointed. It weighs 200 pounds. Take it out. We will be flying in radio silence anyway. We don't need it. The mechanics ripped the radios out. The bottom turret gun, Doolittle said. It creates drag and adds weight. Remove it. Gone. Then, Doolittle did something that shocked everyone. He pointed to the Norden bomb site. The Norden bomb site was the most advanced piece of technology in the American arsenal. It was a mechanical computer that allowed high-altitude precision bombing. It was top secret. Soldiers had orders to destroy it with their lives rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Take it out, Doolittle said. The bombardiers were horrified. Colonel, they asked, how are we supposed to hit our targets without the Norden? Doolittle looked at them. We are not bombing from 20,000 feet, he said. We are going in on the deck, 1,500 feet, maybe lower. You don't need a computer to drop a bomb from that height. He replaced the $20,000 bomb sight with a simple piece of aluminum called the Mark Twain. It cost 20 cents to make in the machine shop. It looked like a toy, but it saved vital weight. Then came the most controversial decision of all, the tail guns. Doolittle needed to shave off every single ounce. He ordered the .250 caliber machine guns in the tail to be removed. The pilots were on the verge of revolt. "Colonel," one of them shouted, "if we take out the tail guns, we are defenseless from the rear. If a Japanese Zero fighter gets behind us, we are dead men, they will chew us up." Doolittle knew the risk. He felt the weight of it, but he also knew the physics. If they kept the guns, they wouldn't get off the deck. He had to improvise. He had to use psychology instead of bullets. He turned to the mechanics. "Find me some wooden broomsticks," he said. The mechanics looked at him like he was crazy. "Are the broomsticks to the right length?" Doolittle ordered. "Paint them black and stick them out the back of the tail." It was absurd. It was almost funny. The United States was preparing to launch the most daring raid in history against the most powerful empire in the Pacific, armed with painted broomsticks. They were betting their lives on a bluff. They hoped that Japanese fighter pilots would see the black sticks, think they were real guns, and be too scared to attack from the rear, with the weight gone. Now came the fuel. They had to turn the bombers into flying gas stations. They installed a rubber fuel tank in the crawlway above the bomb bay. It was a nightmare. The rubber was prone to leaking. The fumes would fill the cockpit, making the pilots dizzy and nauseous. They installed a massive steel tank inside the bomb bay itself. This took up so much space that they could only carry 4 bombs, 3 high explosives, 1 incendiary, but it still wasn't enough. Doolittle ordered 10 5-gallon jerry cans for each plane. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. As they flew toward Japan, the rear gunner would have to manually pour the gasoline from the jerry cans into the main tank. Picture this. You are flying at 200 miles per hour over enemy territory. The plane is bouncing in the turbulence, and you are pouring highly explosive aviation fuel into a hole. 1 spark, 1 static shock, 1 tracer bullet from a Japanese plane, and the bomber would turn into a fireball. There would be no survivors. The machine was finally ready, a stripped-down, fuel-soaked, defenseless suicide machine. Now, Doolittle needed the men to fly it. He went to the 17th Bombardment Group. He gathered the pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners in a briefing room. He stood at the front. The room was thick with tension. Doolittle looked at the faces of his men. They were just kids. Most of them were 22, 23 years old. They had joined the army to serve their country, but they had no idea what was about to be asked of them. Doolittle didn't make a speech about glory. He spoke quietly. "I am looking for volunteers," he said. "I cannot tell you where we are going. I cannot tell you the target. All I can tell you is that this mission is extremely dangerous. It will take you out of the country, and there is a very high probability that you will not return." He let the silence hang in the room. "You will not return." He gave them an out. "If you have a wife or children, or if you just don't want to go, you can leave now. No one will think less of you." The men looked at each other. They thought about their families. They thought about the life they had ahead of them, and then one pilot stood up, then another. Then the gunner stood up. The navigator stood up. Within minutes, every single man in the room was standing. Not one man walked away. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know they would be flying off a boat. They didn't know they would be flying into the heart of the Japanese Empire with broomsticks for guns. All they knew was that their country needed them, and Jimmy Doolittle was leading them, and that was enough. They packed their bags. They wrote their final letters home, careful not to say where they were going, and they headed to a secret base in Florida called Eglin Field. There, on a secluded runway, the Navy had drawn 2 white lines. The distance between the lines was exactly 500 feet, the length of the deck of the USS Hornet. The pilots sat in their cockpits and looked at the short distance, 500 feet. Usually, they used 3,000 feet. They looked at Doolittle. They looked at the white lines. "This is impossible," one pilot whispered, but Doolittle just revved his engines. The training was about to begin, and it would push them to the very edge of disaster. March 1st, 1942, Eglin Field, Florida. The morning air was filled with the smell of burnt rubber and high-octane gasoline. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stood by the side of the runway. He watched as a B-25 bomber roared down the tarmac. The pilot was struggling. The engines were screaming at maximum power, but the heavy plane was refusing to lift. It ate up 500 feet, then 600, then 700. Finally, it lumbered into the air, its wheels barely clearing the trees at the end of the runway. Doolittle shook his head. "Too slow," he muttered. "On the ship, that crew would be dead." The training was a disaster. These Army pilots were used to miles of concrete. They were used to speed. They were taught that you need at least 100 miles per hour to get a bomber airborne, but the Navy instructor, Lieutenant Henry Miller, was trying to teach them something that went against every instinct they had. He was teaching them to fly without speed. "You have to hang on the props." Miller shouted at them. The technique was terrifying. The pilot had to hold the brakes. He had to push the throttles forward until the right cyclone engines were shaking the entire airframe. The manifold pressure gauges had to be in the red zone. The noise was physically painful. Then, release the brakes. The plane would lurch forward. As soon as the airspeed indicator hit nearly zero, the pilot had to pull back on the yoke, hard. The nose of the plane would shoot up. The tail skid would almost scrape the ground. The plane would hang in the air, shuddering, on the verge of a stall if the pilot pulled back too much. The wings would lose lift and the plane would smash into the ground if he didn't pull back enough. He would run off the end of the deck. It was a dance with death. Day after day, they practiced. Tires blew out from the friction, engines overheated, brakes caught fire. One pilot, Lieutenant Truelove, stalled his plane at 300 feet. It slammed back onto the runway, bouncing violently. The landing gear collapsed. The plane skidded sideways in a shower of sparks. The crews watched in silence. They knew that if that happened on the aircraft carrier, there would be no runway to skid on. There would only be the cold, dark ocean, but slowly, miraculously, they got better. Doolittle led by example. He pushed his plane to the limit. He managed to get airborne in less than 300 feet. The other pilots saw it, and they followed. By the end of March, the impossible had become routine. They could take a 35,000-pound bomber and make it jump into the sky like a fighter plane. They were ready. April 1st, 1942. The secret mission moved to San Francisco. The USS Hornet, a massive aircraft carrier, was docked at the pier. It was a strange sight. Usually, a carrier deck is filled with small, folding-wing Navy fighters. But today, massive cranes were lifting 16 Army bombers onto the ship. They were too big for the elevators. They couldn't be stored below deck in the hangar, so they had to be parked right on the flight deck. They were lashed down with steel cables. They were packed so tightly together that you could barely walk between them. The tail of one plane was almost touching the nose of the next. The USS Hornet looked less like a warship and more like a floating parking lot. On April 2nd, the Hornet slipped its moorings. It sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge. The fog was thick. The sailors on the deck shivered in the cold Pacific air. The destination was still a secret. Rumors were flying among the crew. "We are delivering planes to Hawaii," one sailor said. "No, we are going to Russia," said another. But once the coastline of California disappeared behind them, and they were surrounded by the endless blue of the Pacific, Captain Mark Mitcher picked up the microphone. His voice boomed throughout the ship. "Attention all hands." The ship went silent. Men stopped working. They looked up at the loudspeakers. "The destination of this task force is Tokyo." For a second, there was silence. Then, the ship exploded, cheering, yelling. Sailors threw their hats in the air. Men slapped each other on the back. After the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, finally, they were going to punch back, but for the 80 men of the Doolittle Raiders, the cheering was background noise. They went to their quarters. They checked their maps. They saw the distance. They saw the vastness of the ocean. They realized that this wasn't just a mission. It was a gamble, and the stakes were their lives. The voyage was a nightmare as they sailed further west. The weather turned against them. The Pacific Ocean is not peaceful, it is violent. Gale force winds hammered the ship. Waves, 30 to 40 feet high, crashed over the bow. The USS Hornet pitched and rolled on the flight deck. The situation was critical. The 16 bombers were exposed to the elements. The salt spray was everywhere. Salt is the enemy of aluminum. It eats through metal, it corrodes engines. The mechanics had to work 24 hours a day. They climbed over the slippery plains, fighting the wind, trying to keep the engines clean inside the ship. The pilots played poker to pass the time. They smoked cigarettes. They wrote letters. Doolittle moved among them. He was calm. He checked on every man. One night, in the mess hall, a pilot asked him, "Colonel, what happens if we lose an engine over Japan?" Doolittle didn't lie. "You bail out," he said, "or you crash land." "And if we are captured?" Doolittle's face hardened. "The Japanese have never been bombed before," he said quietly. "They will be angry. They will not treat prisoners well." He paused. "I intend to never be captured." The message was clear: save the last bullet for yourself. April 17th. The task force was now deep in enemy waters. They were joined by the USS Enterprise, another carrier providing air cover. The tension was electric. Every radar blip, every shadow on the horizon, could be the Japanese Navy. The plan was to get within 400 miles of Japan. They would launch at night. The darkness would protect them. They would bomb Tokyo in the early morning and land in China by daylight. It was a good plan, but war does not care about plans. April 18th. 0300 hours. The crews were sleeping or trying to sleep. Suddenly, the ship's radar picked up surface contacts. Two small blips, Japanese patrol boats. The task force changed course to avoid them. They slipped away into the darkness. But the enemy was out there. They were watching. A net of fishing trawlers equipped with radios, guarding the approach to the Empire. 0600 hours, sunrise. The weather was horrific. The sky was gray and heavy. The rain was coming down in sheets. The waves were so big that green water was washing over the flight deck. Doolittle was on the bridge with Captain Mitcher. They were scanning the horizon with binoculars, and then they saw it about 10,000 yards away, a small, white speck bobbing in the waves. It was the Nidho Maru, a Japanese patrol boat. Number 23, the alarm bells screamed. General quarters, man your battle stations. The USS Nashville, a cruiser escorting the carriers, opened fire. Boom! The sound of the 6-inch guns shattered the morning. Water geysers erupted around the tiny Japanese boat. But it was too late. The radio operator on the Nidho Maru was frantic. He was tapping out a message in Morse code. Enemy aircraft carrier sighted. Enemy aircraft carrier sighted. Coordinate: 600 miles east of Tokyo. The secret was out. The message was traveling at the speed of light to the Japanese High Command. On the bridge of the Hornet, Admiral Halsey had a split-second decision to make. He looked at the map. They were still 650 miles from Japan. If they launched now, the bombers would burn precious fuel just to get to the target. They would arrive in China on fumes. They would likely crash in the dark, but if they waited, the Japanese Navy would descend on them like a pack of wolves. The Zero fighters would swarm the carriers. The bombers sitting on the deck would be sitting ducks. They would be destroyed before they could even start their engines. Halsey didn't hesitate. He valued the lives of his sailors, and he trusted Jimmy Doolittle. He grabbed the signal lamp. He flashed the order to the Hornet. It was short. It was brutal. Launch planes to Tokyo. On the flight deck, the loudspeakers crackled. Army pilots, man your planes. Pandemonium broke out. 80 men grabbed their gear. They scrambled up the ladders to the flight deck. The wind hit them like a hammer. It was blowing at 40 knots. The rain stung their faces. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of plane number 1. He looked at the wooden deck. It was wet. It was moving up and down 20 feet with every wave. He looked at the distance, 467 feet. He remembered the training at Eglin Field. He remembered the white lines, but this wasn't a white line on a concrete runway. This was a moving ship in a storm, and if he failed, 15 other planes would be trapped behind him. The mission would be over. He strapped himself in. He looked at his co-pilot, Lieutenant Dick Cole. Cole gave him a thumbs up. Doolittle turned the ignition switches. The propeller blades turned slowly, then caught. The engines roared to life, spitting blue smoke into the gray air. One by one, 16 bombers started their engines. The sound was deafening. It vibrated through the steel of the ship. It vibrated in the bones of the men. The deck crews were running around, pulling the wheel chocks away. The launch officer stood at the front of the ship. He held a checkered flag. He looked at the bow. It smashed down into a trough of water. White foam sprayed over the deck. He waited. Doolittle jammed the throttles forward. The B-25 shook violently against the brakes. The tires groaned. The officer watched the rhythm of the ocean, up and down, up and down. He waited for the bow to rise. Doolittle watched the flag. His eyes were locked on it. The bow began to lift. The officer dropped the flag. Doolittle released the brakes, and the impossible journey began. The B-25 Mitchell bomber lurching forward did not look like a plane. It looked like a drunk beast stumbling on ice. The wooden deck was slick with rain and oil. The wind was howling at 40 knots, smashing into the nose of the aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle jammed the throttles to the firewall. The twin right cyclone engine screamed. 44 inches of manifold pressure. 2,600 RPM. The noise was a physical blow to the chest, but the plane was heavy. 35,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and high explosives. It moved sluggishly. Doolittle fought the controls. He kicked the rudder pedals, trying to keep the nose wheel on the white line painted on the deck. The carrier's superstructure, the island, loomed on his right. The wingtip cleared it by inches. The end of the deck was rushing closer. 300 feet left, 200 feet left. He wasn't fast enough. The airspeed indicator was barely moving. Suddenly, the bow of the USS Hornet plunged down into a massive trough. The runway tilted forward. Doolittle was now driving downhill, straight into the angry gray ocean. If he pulled up now, he would stall. If he waited, he would hit the water. He had to trust the ocean. He had to trust the rhythm. He held his breath. The ship bottomed out in the trough. It shuddered, and then, with the force of a roller coaster, the bow heaved upward. It acted like a giant ramp. Now, Doolittle hauled back on the yoke with both hands. The bomber leaped off the deck, but it didn't fly. It hung in the air, staggering, fighting gravity. The wheels dipped down, dangerously close to the whitecaps. The plane dropped below the level of the deck. The sailors on the ship lost sight of it. "He's down," someone screamed, but then, a roar, the B-25 clawed its way up. The propellers bit into the moist air. Doolittle leveled off, barely 50 feet above the waves. He was airborne. Plane number 1 is away. 15 to go on the flight deck. There was no time to celebrate. The deck crew scrambled. "Bring up number 2, the launch officer shouted. Plane number 2, piloted by Lieutenant Travis Hoover. He was nervous. He had just seen his commander almost crash. Hoover gunned the engines. The flag dropped. He released the brakes too early. The plane skidded. He roared down the deck, but his nerves got the better of him. He pulled back on the yoke too soon. The bomber lifted, then slammed back down onto the wood. The tail skid dragged along the deck, sending a shower of sparks flying. The plane bounced. It shuddered. Hoover fought it. He forced the nose down to gain speed, then yanked it back up right at the edge. He dropped off the bow like a stone. The crew on the Hornet ran to the edge, expecting to see a splash. Instead, they saw Hoover's plane skimming the waves, water spraying off his tires. He struggled for altitude, wobbling left and right. Finally, he stabilized. Plane number 2 is away. 14 to go. The rhythm of the launch became a terrifying drumbeat. Rev release. Roar, launch. Plane number 3, Captain Robert Gray. He was a cool customer. He waited for the pitch. He timed the wave perfectly. His takeoff was smooth, aggressive, perfect. Plane number 3 is away. 13 to go. Plane number 4, Lieutenant Everett Hallstrom. His plane was sluggish. One engine was coughing. The salt spray was choking the carburetor. He used every inch of the deck. He cleared the bow by 5 feet. Plane number 4 is away, 12 to go, plane number 5. Captain David Jones. Jones had a problem. He had been given extra fuel. His plane was the heaviest of them all. He sat on the runway, revving the engines until the temperature gauges spiked. He needed every ounce of thrust. When he released the brakes, the plane didn't want to move. It crawled. The deck crew watched in horror. He's not gonna make it. Jones kept the nose down. He didn't pull back until the main wheels were literally hanging over the abyss. The plane dropped. It disappeared from view. Seconds passed. 1, 2, 3. Then, the drone of the engines rose again. Jones had recovered inches from the water. Plane number 5 is away. 11 to go. The storm was getting worse. The rain was coming down horizontally. The deck was heaving violently, pitching up and down 30 feet. Plane number 6. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark. Away. 10 to go. Plane number 7. Lieutenant Ted Lawson. His plane, the ruptured duck, would become famous later, but right now, it was just another heavy beast trying to kill him. He forgot to lower his wing flaps as he rolled down the deck. He realized the mistake. He reached down, frantically pumping the flap handle while steering with his other hand. The flaps extended just as he hit the ramp. The lift caught him. He shot up like a rocket. Plane number 7 is away. 9 to go. Plane number 8. Captain York. Away. 8 to go. Plane number 9. Lieutenant Watson. Away. 7 to go. The flight deck was becoming a chaotic factory of noise and adrenaline. The smell of exhaust fumes mixed with the salt spray. The prop wash from the launching bombers was whipping across the deck, knocking sailors off their feet. Plane number 10. Lieutenant Richard Joyce. Away. 6 to go. Plane number 11. Captain Ross Greening. Away. 5 to go. Plane number 12. Lieutenant William Bauer. Away. 4 to go. Plane number 13. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy. Away. 3 to go. Plane number 14. Major John Hilger. He was Doolittle's second in command. He watched the others go. He knew the odds were getting worse. The wind was shifting. It was gusting from the side now. A crosswind is a pilot's nightmare on a narrow deck. It pushes the plane sideways. Hilger fought the rudder. His right wheel lifted off the deck before the left one. He crabbed into the air, flying sideways for a terrifying second before straightening out. Plane number 14 is away. 2 to go. Plane number 15. Lieutenant Donald Smith. Away. 1 to go. And then there was one, plane number 16, piloted by Lieutenant William Bill Farrow. He sat at the very back of the carrier. In theory, he had the easiest job. He had the most runway. The deck was empty in front of him, but in reality, he was in the deadliest position. The propeller wash from the previous 15 bombers had churned the air over the deck into a turbulent hurricane. The deck was slippery with oil dripping from the other engines, and the weather had peaked. The Hornet was smashing through waves that were crashing over the flight deck itself. As Farrow revved his engines, the ship pitched down violently. He started to slide forward before he even released the brakes. "Hold it, hold it," the launch officer screamed, signaling frantically. Farrow slammed on the brakes. The plane skidded to a halt. He waited. The deck crew ran out to check the wheels. They were close, too close to the spinning props. One sailor slipped on the wet wood. He fell. He slid across the deck, toward the roaring propeller of the right engine. It was a meat grinder waiting to happen. Another sailor grabbed his life vest and yanked him back just inches from the blades. Farrow didn't see it. He was focused on the flag. The ship heaved up. The flag dropped. Farrow released the brakes. Plane number 16 began its roll. It gathered speed, but the turbulence hit it. The plane bounced. It drifted left, then right. Farrow wrestled with the yoke. He was fighting the wind, the ship, and the plane. He reached the end of the deck. He pulled back. The tail skid hit the deck with a sickening crunch. The nose pitched up too high. It was a stall. The plane hung in the air, motionless. The engines roared, but the wings had no grip. It began to fall backward toward the water. The tail gunner, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, looked down. He saw the propellers of the ship churning the water below. If they crashed here, the ship would run them over. Pharaoh jammed the stick forward. He sacrificed altitude for speed. The nose dropped. The plane dove toward the waves. He leveled out so low that the spray hit the fuselage. He held it there, flying in the ground effect, using the cushion of air between the wings and the water to stay aloft. Slowly, agonizingly, the airspeed needle began to climb. 100, 110, 120, he pulled up. Plane number 16 is away, 0 to go. The deck of the USS Hornet fell silent. The roar of the engines faded into the distance. The sailors stood there, soaked to the bone, watching the gray horizon. 16 specks, 16 bombers, 80 men. They were gone. They had done the impossible. They had launched a squadron of Army bombers from a Navy ship in the middle of a typhoon. But now, the celebration died in their throats. Because they knew the truth. Doolittle and his men were alone. They had no fighter escort. They had no radio support. They had no way to turn back. They were flying into the heart of the Japanese Empire, and they were flying on empty. The early launch meant they were 200 miles short on fuel. The math was still the same. They would reach Tokyo. They would drop their bombs, but reaching safety in China, it was a mathematical impossibility. They were flying dead men's planes, and the real war had just begun. Midday, April 18th. The North Pacific Ocean. 6 hours have passed since the launch. 6 hours of noise, 6 hours of vibration, 6 hours of terror. The 16 B-25 bombers are no longer together. They have spread out, a loose, invisible chain stretching across the ocean. They are flying on the deck, 50 feet above the water. This is low-level flying at its most extreme. At this height, the pilots don't just see the waves, they feel them. The salt spray hits the windshield like rain. The turbulence slams the planes up and down, testing the strength of the aluminum wings. Inside the cockpit of plane number 1, Jimmy Doolittle is tired. His arms ache from wrestling the yoke. His ears are ringing from the constant roar of the Wright Cyclone engines. He checks the fuel gauges. They are dropping fast. The headwinds have been brutal. They are burning more gas than they calculated. He looks at his navigator, Lieutenant Henry Potter. Potter is hunched over his maps. He is using a slide rule and a stopwatch. There is no GPS, no radar, no radio beacons. They are navigating by dead reckoning. Speed times time equals distance. If they are off by just 2 degrees, they will miss Japan entirely. They will fly into the empty ocean until their tanks run dry, and they vanish forever. But Potter points forward. "Bearing is good, Colonel," he shouts over the engine noise. Doolittle squints through the salt-crusted glass. The gray horizon is beginning to change color. It is turning green. Land, Japan, the adrenaline spikes. Doolittle pulls back gently on the yoke. The bomber climbs slightly. They cross the coastline. It is startlingly peaceful below them. It is not a fortress. It is a picture postcard. There are green rice paddies, small villages with wooden houses, farmers working in the fields. The sun is shining. It is Saturday noon in Japan. People are eating lunch. Children are playing. Doolittle flies lower. He passes over a schoolyard. He can see the children looking up. They are waving. They see a twin-engine bomber. They see the red circles on the wings. And in the bright sunlight, they mistake the American star for the Japanese sun. They think it is their own Air Force. They think it is a training exercise. Doolittle's co-pilot, Dick Cole, looks down. He sees a man on a bicycle stop and wave his hat. It is a surreal moment. These men are about to unleash hell on this country. And the people are welcoming them like heroes, but the deception cannot last. Doolittle checks his map. He is looking for Tokyo, and then he sees it, a massive sprawl of buildings, factories, smoke stacks, the beating heart of the Japanese Empire. He pushes the throttle forward. "Climb," he orders. The B-25 roars upward. They need to get to 1,200 feet to drop the bomb safely. The element of surprise is about to vanish. Doolittle opens the bomb bay doors. The wind howls into the open belly of the plane. Inside, 4 bombs are waiting, 3 high explosive, 1 incendiary on the bombs. The crew has written messages. "To Tojo, with love. Remember Pearl Harbor." Doolittle levels the plane. He looks through the 20-cent Mark Twain bomb sight. It is a crude piece of metal, but it lines up perfectly with the factory complex below. He watches the crosshairs drift over the target. Steady, steady. Bombs away. The aircraft jumps upward. Suddenly 2,000 pounds lighter. 4 dark shapes fall from the belly. They tumble through the air for 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The first bomb hits a factory roof. Flash. A massive orange fireball erupts in the middle of Tokyo. Then another, and another. The ground shakes. Smoke billows into the sky. On the ground, the waving stops. The smiles disappear. Panic. Sirens begin to wail across the city. Air raid wardens scream into telephones. Enemy aircraft, enemy aircraft. This is not a drill. The Japanese military is stunned. It is impossible. Where did they come from? There are no American bases within 2,000 miles. But the sky is filling with black puffs of smoke. Flak, anti-aircraft fire. Doolittle banks the plane hard to the left. He dives back down toward the ground. Speed is life. Black explosions blossom around him, shrapnel pinging against the fuselage like hail. He pushes the nose down. 800 feet, 500 feet, 200 feet. He is flying aggressively now, jinking left and right to throw off the gunners. He looks back. Smoke is rising from the target. He has done it. He has struck the Emperor, but he is not alone. Behind him, 15 other bombers are arriving. Plane number 3, piloted by Robert Gray, comes in low over the bay. He targets a steel mill. He drops his bombs and banks away. His gunner strafing a Japanese warship in the harbor. Plane number 7, the Ruptured Duck, piloted by Ted Lawson. Lawson is flying so low he has to pull up to avoid hitting chimneys. He targets a factory. He drops his bombs. Boom. The explosion is so close that the shockwave hits the plane. The Ruptured Duck bounces in the air like a toy. Lawson fights the controls. Suddenly, 6 Japanese Zero fighters appear out of the clouds. They dive on the bombers. This is what the crews feared. They have no tail guns. They have only painted broomsticks. The Zeros come in fast. But something strange happens. The Japanese pilots see the black sticks sticking out of the tails. They hesitate. They break off the attack. The bluff works for a few precious seconds. The broomsticks save their lives, but the sky is getting crowded with lead. Machine gun fire tears through the wings of plane number 10. A hole is punched in the fuselage of plane number 4. It is chaos. 30 seconds, that is all it takes. 30 seconds of bombing, 30 seconds of destruction, and then they are gone. The 16 bombers turn west, away from Tokyo, away from the ocean, toward China. The adrenaline begins to fade and a cold, hard reality sets in. Doolittle checks his fuel gauges again. They are dangerously low. He does the math. They have flown past the point of no return. The plan was to land at friendly airfields in Chacha, China. The Chinese government had promised to turn on radio beacons to guide them in, but it is getting late. The sun is setting, and ahead of them, a massive storm front is building, dark. Black clouds blocking the path to safety. Doolittle looks at his crew. "We are not going to make the airfields," he says quietly. The engines hum. The fuel needles drop toward the red line. Empty. They are leaving the danger of combat and flying into the certainty of a crash. The raid was a success, but the survival is about to become a nightmare. Night is falling over the China Sea, and the fuel lights are starting to flicker. Dusk, April 18th. The sun is dying over the East China Sea, and with the sun, the hope of the Doolittle Raiders is fading too. They have been in the air for 13 hours, 13 hours of vibration, 13 hours of noise, 13 hours of wrestling a 35,000-pound metal beast through the sky. The pilots are beyond exhausted. Their eyes are burning. Their muscles are cramping. They are flying on pure adrenaline. But the adrenaline is running out, and so is the fuel. In the cockpit of plane number 1, Jimmy Doolittle watches the fuel gauges with a sense of dread. The needles are bouncing on the red line. Empty. The 10 jerry cans in the back, empty. The rubber tank in the crawlway, dry. The steel tank in the bomb bay, vapor. They are running on fumes according to the plan. They should be seeing the coastline of China by now. They should be picking up a radio homing beacon from the airfield in Chachow. Doolittle puts on his headset. He tunes the radio. Static. Just the hiss of the empty sky. Anything, he asks his navigator. Nothing, Colonel. Silence. They don't know it yet. But the plane carrying the homing beacon crashed in a storm before it could reach the airfield. The raiders are flying blind toward a country they don't know, in the dark, and then the weather turns from bad to nightmare. A massive low-pressure front sits over the coast of China. It is a wall of black clouds. Rain is falling in sheets. Lightning cracks the sky, illuminating the terrified faces of the crew for a split second before plunging them back into darkness. Visibility is zero. Doolittle pulls up. He has to climb over the storm. Climb to 6,000 feet, he orders, but climbing burns fuel. It is a death sentence for the engines. The B-25 groans as it claws its way up into the black void. Rain lashes against the windshield like gravel. The wind tosses the bomber around like a leaf. Doolittle looks at the clock. It is 0900 hours. Night has fallen completely. Suddenly, the red light on the dashboard flickers, fuel pressure warning. Doolittle's heart stops. The left engine coughs, put. Then, silence. The propeller blades feather and stop spinning. The bomber lurches violently to the left. The dead weight of the engine drags the wing down. Doolittle fights the yoke. He jams his foot on the right rudder pedal to compensate. Now they are flying a heavy bomber, in a storm, at night. One engine, and the second engine is thirsty. Doolittle looks at his crew, Paul Leonard, the crew chief, Fred Bremer. The bombardier, they are looking at him, they are waiting for the order. Doolittle knows that trying to land a B-25 in these conditions, on unknown terrain, is suicide if they hit a mountain. They die if they hit the water. They drown. There is only one choice left, a choice no pilot ever wants to make. Bail out, Doolittle says. His voice is calm. Bail out, bail out. Bail out. It is a terrifying command. Jump out of a plane, into a storm, into the pitch-black night, over a country where you don't speak the language, but the alternative is death. The crew unbuckles their harnesses. They put on their parachutes. The hatch in the floor is kicked open. The roar of the wind fills the cabin. Rain sprays inside. Go, go, one by one. They drop into the hole. They vanish into the darkness. Finally, Doolittle is alone, the commander of the mission. The man who promised to bring them home. He sets the autopilot. The right engine is sputtering now. It has seconds of life left. Doolittle stands up. He looks at his empty pilot's seat. He looks at the dashboard. He feels a deep, crushing failure. He believes he has lost all 16 planes. He believes he has sent 80 men to their deaths. He believes he will be court-martialed if he survives. He steps to the hatch. He jumps. The wind rips him away from the plane. He falls through the rain. Ounce. 1, 2, 3. He pulls the ripcord. The chute opens with a violent jerk. He hangs there, drifting in the dark, waiting to hit the ground. Meanwhile, miles away, the nightmare is different for the other crews. Plane number 7, the Ruptured Duck, piloted by Lieutenant Ted Lawson. Lawson has no fuel to climb. His engines are coughing. He is flying low, too low. He is trying to find a beach, a road, anything flat. He sees a break in the clouds, a faint line of white foam. Surf, a beach. Prepare for crash landing, Lawson screams. He drops the landing gear. He lowers the flaps. The bomber descends toward the water. 110 miles per hour, darkness. Rain. Lawson strains his eyes. He thinks he sees sand. He cuts the engines. The plane glides, but his depth perception is tricked by the storm. The sand is not sand, it is water. The wheels hit the waves. The impact is catastrophic. The B-25 stops instantly. From 100 miles an hour to 0 in a split second. The nose of the plane smashes into the water. The fuselage snaps in half. Lawson is thrown through the windshield. His leg is smashed against the metal frame. The gunner is thrown out the back. The plane flips over and sinks in the surf. Silence. Then, screams. Lawson is floating in the water. The salt water stings his open wounds. He can't feel his leg. Help, help me. But there is no one. Just the sound of the ocean crashing against the wreck. Plane number 6. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark. He is forced to ditch in the sea. The plane sinks. His crew struggles to get into the life raft. One man is trapped inside the sinking metal coffin. He drowns in the dark. The others cling to the raft, shivering, injured, waiting for a sunrise that feels like it will never come. Plane number 16. Lieutenant Farrow. The last plane off the deck. He flies until the tanks are bone dry. The engines quit. The silence is deafening. Jump. They jump over Japanese-occupied China as they float down. They see flashlights on the ground. They hear dogs barking. They are falling straight into the hands of the enemy across the coast of China. It is a scene of scattered destruction. 16 proud bombers, the most advanced machines of their time. Now, they are burning wreckage on mountainsides. They are twisted metal in rice paddies. They are underwater graves. 80 men falling from the sky. Some land in trees, hanging by their parachute cords like puppets. Some land in mud, breaking ankles and ribs. Some land and don't get up. Doolittle lands in a pile of dung in a rice paddy. He unbuckles his chute. He stands up in the knee-deep mud. He is alive, but he is alone. He has no idea where he is. He has no idea if his men are alive. He sits down on a small earthen wall. He puts his head in his hands. The rain continues to fall. He cries, not for himself, but for his men. He thinks the mission is a total failure. He doesn't know that back in America, the headlines are already being printed. Tokyo bombed. He doesn't know that he is already a hero. All he knows is the cold, the dark, and the silence of a graveyard. The Doolittle Raid is over. The struggle for survival has just begun. Dawn breaks over the mountains of China. April 19th. The storm has passed. The sky is gray and quiet. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stands next to the wreckage of his plane. It is a pile of twisted aluminum. The wings are torn off. The fuselage is shattered. The once mighty B-25 bomber is now just junk scattered across a rice paddy. Doolittle looks at it and he feels sick. His crew chief, Sergeant Paul Leonard, is standing next to him. They are both covered in mud. They are shivering. Doolittle sits down on a wet rock. He puts his head in his hands. "Paul," he whispers. "This is it. I ruined the mission. I lost all 16 planes. I lost the men. I am going to be court-martialed. I will probably spend the rest of the war in Leavenworth prison." He truly believes this. To him, the mission is a catastrophic failure. Sergeant Leonard looks at his commander. He looks at the wreckage. Then he looks Doolittle in the eye. "No, Colonel," Leonard says. "You're wrong." Doolittle looks up. "Sir," Leonard says with a smile, "I think they are going to give you the Congressional Medal of Honor." Doolittle shakes his head. "I don't think so, Paul, but he was wrong, and the sergeant was right. Across the Chinese countryside, a miracle is happening. The raiders are coming out of the mist. They are injured. Some have broken legs. Some have burns. Some are bleeding. They stumble into small villages. They don't speak the language. They look like aliens in their flight suits. The Chinese villagers have never seen Americans before. They are scared at first. But then, they see the Japanese patrol planes circling overhead. They realize these men are enemies of Japan, and in war, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Chinese people open their doors. They have nothing. They are poor farmers, but they give the Americans their beds. They give them rice. They hide them in caves. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, the pilot of the ruptured duck, is in bad shape. His leg is infected. The pain is unbearable. A group of Chinese villagers builds a makeshift stretcher. They carry him for days over the mountains, up steep cliffs, through mud, through rain. They know that if the Japanese soldiers catch them helping an American, they will be executed, but they carry him anyway. They save his life. Later, an American doctor will have to amputate Lawson's leg, but he will survive to write the famous book. 30 seconds over Tokyo. Slowly, the raiders are gathered together. Of the 80 men who flew into the storm, 69 survived the crash landings and bailouts. But not everyone made it. 3 men died in the crashes. 8 men were captured by the Japanese army. Their fate was horrific. They were tortured. They were starved. They were put on a show trial. 3 of them, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad in a Shanghai cemetery. Another, Lieutenant Bob Metter, died of starvation in prison. The remaining 4 spent years in solitary confinement, in hell on earth, until the war ended. But while the raiders were escaping, a darkness fell over China. The Japanese high command was furious. They had been humiliated. American bombers had touched the sacred soil of Tokyo, and they knew the bombers had landed in China. They wanted revenge, and they didn't care who paid the price. The Japanese army launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. It was not a military operation. It was an extermination. 53 Japanese battalions marched into the provinces where the raiders had landed. They had orders to burn everything. They burned the villages that had sheltered the Americans. They burned the crops. They poisoned the wells with typhoid and cholera bacteria. They slaughtered the livestock. And then they turned on the people, men, women, children, anyone who might have seen an American plane, anyone who might have given a cup of water to a pilot. They were bayoneted. They were shot. They were burned alive in their homes. The scale of the massacre is hard to comprehend. Historians estimate that 250,000 Chinese civilians were murdered. 250,000. Think about that number. For every one of the 80 American raiders, more than 3,000 Chinese people died to save them. It was a blood debt that could never be repaid. Back in Washington, D.C., the mood was very different when the news broke. Tokyo bombed. The United States went wild. After months of defeat, after Pearl Harbor, after Bataan, finally, America had struck back. Newspaper headlines screamed the victory. Morale skyrocketed. People lined up at recruitment centers. Factory production soared. Jimmy Doolittle was brought home. He was still terrified of being court-martialed. He thought he was walking to his doom. Instead, he was driven to the White House. President Roosevelt was waiting for him on May 19, 1942. In a simple ceremony, President Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor around Doolittle's neck. Doolittle stood there, humble, quiet. He told the president, "I would spend the rest of my life paying back the debt I owe to the young men who went with me." He was promoted to brigadier general. He would go on to command the 8th Air Force in Europe, destroying the German Luftwaffe. But the Doolittle Raid did something more important than just boost morale. It changed the mind of the Japanese Navy. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was shocked. He realized that the Japanese homeland was vulnerable. He decided that he had to destroy the American aircraft carriers once and for all. He rushed his fleet into a trap near a tiny island called Midway. Because of the Doolittle Raid, the Japanese Navy made a mistake. They overextended, and at the Battle of Midway, just 2 months later, the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers. The tide of the war turned. If Doolittle hadn't bombed Tokyo, the Battle of Midway might never have happened, and the war could have dragged on for years longer. The legacy of the raiders lived on long after the war. Every year, on April 18th, the surviving raiders would meet for a reunion. They had a special wooden case. Inside were 80 silver goblets. Each goblet had the name of a raider engraved on it. At every reunion, they would toast the men who had died that year. Then, they would turn the dead men's goblets upside down. Year by year, the number of upright goblets grew smaller. The reunions became quieter. In 2013, only 4 raiders were left: Dick Cole, Edward Saylor, David Thatcher, Robert Hite. They met for the final time. They opened a bottle of Hennessy cognac from 1896, the year Jimmy Doolittle was born. They poured the cognac into their silver cups. They raised a toast to the men who died in the crashes, to the men who were executed, to the men who died in the war, and to the thousands of Chinese civilians who gave their lives to save them. They drank the cognac, and they turned their goblets upside down. Today, all 80 goblets are upside down. The last raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, passed away in 2019 at the age of 103. The men are gone, but the legend remains. They were ordinary men, school teachers, farm boys, mechanics. They were asked to do the impossible, to take off from a ship that was too short, to fly a plane that was too heavy, to bomb an enemy that was too strong. and to survive a landing that was guaranteed to crash. They didn't do it for fame, they didn't do it for money. They did it because their country was on its knees, and someone had to stand up. On a rainy morning in April 1942, 16 bombers clawed their way into the sky and proved that even in the darkest hour, there is always hope. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the greatest stories of World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us keep these memories alive. And subscribe to the channel for more documentaries on the heroes who saved the world. From the deck of the Hornet to the rice paddies of China. Never forget the Doolittle Raiders. I'll see you in the next one.